I'm really glad to be here. Bill Camp from the Central Labor Council asked me to come and say a few words, and I'm going to talk a little bit about numbers and data. I am an economist, so it's part of my profession. And I'll try not to bore you too much with the data. I'm struggling against the typical definition of what an economist is. You know, it's someone who's good at math, but doesn't have enough of a personality to be an accountant. So I'll try and break that pattern. I really want to do three things. One is tell you a bit about some of the research that I've done that supports some of the arguments at the report that the Center for American Progress has done. And then talk a bit about the specifics of the report and then what the implications are for the Employee Free Choice Act. So the first thing is I look at regional economies. And part of what I've been doing along with a number of colleagues is looking at the relationship between inequality and growth at a regional scale. And what is very clear across the country is that those regions that have greater equity, less inequality, grow faster. It's a direct relationship. And sometimes you wonder, well, maybe that's only working in rapidly growing regions. So we actually look specifically at slow-growing regions and declining regions, the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt cities, and it turns out that relationship between equity and growth is stronger in a declining economy than in a stronger economy. And you can imagine the reasons for that, right? With growing inequality, you get wealthier residents fleeing the inner city, going to the suburbs. You have less consumption as those at the lower end of the economic spectrum have less purchasing power. You have an underinvestment in education, an underinvestment in the infrastructure that's required for trade and distribution of goods. There's a whole series of things that leads to slow economic growth when you have inequality. And so that's part of why I was so excited to see this report from the Center for American Progress, because they're making a couple of really key points. First, they're saying that union workers earn more than similar non-union workers. When you control for education level, you control for occupation. If you're a unionized worker in California, you earn about 12.7% more than for a non-unionized worker, right? But they're not just looking at that in the short-term time frame, right? They're looking at it in the longer term and saying, well, if we had the same unionization levels now that we did in 1983, what would that mean for the California economy? And it turns out close to $5 billion of additional spending power in California if we were just at the same levels of unionization and the same wage levels as in 1983. Talk about a stimulus package, $5 billion for the California economy. The other thing they look at in this report, which is really important, is looking at longer-term trends about the relationship between productivity, right, the output per hour. How much does each worker in the California and U.S. economy produce per hour? And how has that changed over time? And then how does that compare with the amount of compensation that workers get in the California economy, right? And they show that while productivity has gone up since the early 1980s by about 75%. The average worker produces 75% more than they did in 1980. Compensation has gone up under 30%. In other words, workers have gotten about a third of what they deserve in terms of their contribution to growing economic wealth. When you look at the longer-term trends of the relationship to productivity and worker compensation back to the 1940s, what you see is between 1945 and the mid-70s, those two figures went hand in hand. As productivity went up, workers' wages went up. A rising tide lifted all boats up until the mid-70s. And we had a dramatic shift in our politics and economic structure in this economy in the 1970s. And since then, that divide between growing productivity and workers' wages has just continued to increase. right? So that brings me to the third point, which is really about the Employee Free Choice Act. And I want to put this in the context of the economic stimulus package that was just passed in Washington, D.C. We need that economic stimulus package. But it's also really important to recognize that the problems in the U.S. economy are not just the result of the last 2 years of Wall Street and real estate greed. We have a long-term structural problem in this economy where workers have been getting less and less of the economic pie and being able to spend less and less money on basic necessities of life and consumer goods. 70% of our economy is driven by consumption, by people's expenditures. And we've managed to postpone the reckoning day until this year through the use of credit cards and through the use of home ownership and people taking credit and loans out of their home ownership to sustain their consumption levels. And so it happened in the way it happened through the real estate crisis, but it could have happened through other ways as well. And so we need to be looking at longer-term solutions. The Employee Free Choice Act is a critical component of that longer-term solution, right? When you look at surveys of American workers, anywhere between 50 and 60% of people who respond to those surveys, depending on the survey, say they would like to have collective representation in the workplace. It's important for their working conditions, for their livelihoods. They feel vulnerable as individuals. And yet we know in California, it's about 19% of the workers who are unionized. Nationally, it's about 13%, and in the private sector, it's down close to 7%. That is an incredible gap between those who want collective representation and those who are actually able to achieve it. Why do we have that gap? It's because people are afraid to speak up for themselves in the workplace because they know that when they have the courage to do that, they're putting their family's livelihood on the line. Because we know many employers out there will use any excuse they can to fire someone who's in support of a union. The Employee Free Choice Act, all it does is try to level the playing field. To simply say, if there's a majority of workers in a workplace who have expressed the desire for collective representation, the employer has to bargain with the union. It's simple. And it's an important part of our economic future and for prosperity for all of us in America. So I thank you for your time and courage to all of you in all your organizing efforts. I really appreciate it.